from sin and make ourselves completely devoted to the Lord's purposes. As Jesus would say before the cross, let His will be done, regardless of our thoughts on the matter. Now, having said that, then Paul gets very personal with respect to Timothy himself. You flee these things I've just talked about, these matters that would make one dishonorable. But Timothy has a... How old do you think Timothy was when Paul writes this to him? And I'm asking for your ideas. How old do you think Timothy was? Maybe, well, I'll say maybe in his 40s. I'm not sure probably, but maybe in his 40s. Any other ideas?
I'd say early 20s.
Early 20s? Chris? And the reason is, this is one of the wonderful questions. Whatever number you'd say, I'd say, well, it could be. Because the Bible just does not. Now, scholars have gotten in there and kind of muddied the water by acting as if they know. We just don't. We know when Paul first comes across, it seems, Timothy as a candidate to go with him. And but the problem is we don't know there in Acts how old he was when this relationship with Paul started. We can assume, we can imagine, we can think, but we don't know. We do know this. Whatever age he was, by the way, if you had said 80, I'd said you're wrong. So every answer wasn't right, because whatever the age of Timothy was, he was younger than Paul's. And Paul wasn't 80 when he wrote this. And so he's younger than Paul, young enough so that he can be seen as a son in the faith, not just in terms of conversion, because that wasn't the case, perhaps, but mentoring, which it was, but also beyond that, it was a matter of the age difference as well. Paul was, well, he described himself as Paul the aged. Timothy was a younger man. Flee youthful lusts. He will say in 1 Timothy, flee youthful lusts. And so compared to Paul, Timothy was a younger man. Whatever age he was, though, younger than Paul, we also know this. The things Paul says suggest the fact, number one, that there were those who would be despising his youth. And you have to be a certain age for those older to say, you don't have any right to be speaking. Sit down and listen to the older people and their view of things. And Paul will say in 1 Timothy, let no man despise your youth, but be an example of the believers. And so he was young enough that those older would say, you haven't really earned the right to be speaking. We have a certain distaste for the novice aspect of your very personhood. You're too young. We despise your youth. And Paul says, don't let that happen. You show them by the way you're living that is a false position to take. But we also know from this passage that he's young enough that there are some certain temptations, some certain pratfalls and pitfalls and difficulties that are unique to those older as opposed to those older, younger as opposed to those older. Some of them may do with the impertinence of immaturity. They may have to do with sexual temptations. He talks about these as youthful lusts. And you run away from those. And that takes you back to that passage I referenced just a moment ago in 1 Timothy. Be an example in word, in conversation, in your lifestyle, in spirit, in faith, in the purity of life you live. You show yourself an example to the believers. You flee youthful lusts and instead replace them with these wonderful attributes of Christ-likeness. And so when I asked how old he was, that really wasn't a question that deserved a specific answer, because there's not one. But suffice it to say, well, all of us, most of us, some of us, a few of us, we perhaps are older than we used to be. Have you noticed that lately, that we're older than we used to be? And there are some things that are more problematic now than they were when we were younger. But there are some things we've learned along the ways that have gotten a little easier for us. For one thing that comes with experience and maturity that comes from us is not all of us, but most of us have kind of learned when to let some things go. Some things just aren't worth it. And that's what he's getting into next here. And that's why I believe much of what he's talking about here, it may have to do with the sexual temptations of those younger opposed to those older. But in terms of what he's about to say next, so much has to do with this. This idea that I've got to win every argument, I've got to be seen as the victor in this conversation, I've got to come out on top, I'll argue until you submit. Well, there are those of us who've never gotten past that. But in most cases, I think maturity and experience help us to realize everything is not worth fighting about. There are some fights that have to be had. Not saying that's not the case, but everything is not in that category. And I know that's what he's talking about because he, in context of this, says avoid foolish, ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. Well, the servant of the Lord, which Timothy is, he's not to be involved in quarreling, but he is to be gentle, and he's supposed to be able to teach and then underscore in your mind this last word in verse 24. At least in the New King James, it's the last word. Patient. That's one thing that it's very rare to find a young person that has patience. And many of us as older people have still struggles with patience, but we've learned some things along the way. That everything doesn't have to happen right now. Some things, especially things that are worthwhile, they take time to build. And some people, the way to affect change in their lives is not by pushing and stomping and braying and arguing, but being patient with them and allowing them the space to arrive at a conclusion on their own, which is the way that Jesus did so much of his teaching with the masses. He let them make up their own decisions and didn't coerce or force them into a position. But the servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle and able to teach and patient, and all of this in humility, still correcting those who are in opposition. And so he's not saying, Timothy, you just never take a stand on anything. He's not saying that at all. In fact, in the very next, the chapter after the next one, in chapter 4, he'll say, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. And two of those three are this negative kind of approach, reprove and rebuke. But the question is not whether, Timothy, you do that. The question is, how do you do that? Will you do it in gentleness and patience, firmness, of course, but in a way, hopefully, you don't just win the day and win the argument. Hopefully, over time, you can win the person. And the way you do that is not just by cowing them into submission, but encouraging them to see things in the Bible way, not just your way, but the Lord's way. But I hate to open up this can of worms, but he talks about these foolish and ignorant disputes. We could talk about some of them historically that were going on in the days of Paul. and there are a lot of them, based upon Jewish traditions and Jewish fanciful fictional stories they made about characters that just had a name mentioned and no story about them. They'd give a story to them and then argue the story. Kind of like you'll watch a show on television, and a day or two later you're arguing with somebody about what a fictional character should have done or shouldn't have done and why they do that, and it's just a fictional story. Well, some of that was going on, and there were arguments about things like that, and genealogies that people had just made up out of the whole cloth. But not so much interested about what they were doing, because that's just esoteric academics. I'm curious about what you might think about what are some, I hate to even mention this, but I'm going to open it up to your conversation in just a moment. What are some foolish and ignorant disputes we might have today in the church? And keep in mind, anything you say that is foolish and ignorant, somebody else probably in this room will say, well, no, it's not. And I'm not trying to start an argument here. I'm trying to make a point. And so at least give me something that all of us can seemingly agree. Okay, I'll give you one. I've known of churches that split over the color of carpet. I have. I've not just heard about them, I've known about them. I know of one case where a good elder that lived across the street from the church building, I was there in a meeting with him, ate dinner with him. I was there in a meeting a year or two after, and he wasn't there. I said, where's Brother So-and-so? He lives right across the street. Is he sick? Oh, no, he doesn't attend here anymore. So he's not an elder. He doesn't attend it. Where's he go? Well, 25 miles away. Well, why is he going over there? Well, he got upset during an elders meeting. Well, what was it about? It was about the color of the carpet. And there were 4 elders, and he wanted one color. The other 3 wanted their color, and he stomped out of the building. And they said the last time his foot was in this building, the words he said were, I never get my own way about anything. And that's the last words he spoke in that building. I never get my own way about anything. Well, I think most of us would agree that that probably would be a foolish and an ignorant dispute. Yes, sir. In fact, so many of these trivial arguments we have, it'd always be best to start with a word of prayer. And oftentimes, when you pray about something, you realize about halfway through the prayer, maybe we don't even need to have this conversation. I mean, here I am praying for the Lord to help, and here I am splitting the church over the color of carpet or something. And it makes you realize how ridiculous it is. But you're exactly right there. Now, I haven't been around as long as you have and seen as much as you've seen. but I have been involved with congregations that have actually divided over doctrinal issues. But I've also seen sometimes where personalities are used as, well, no, the doctrine is used as a basis when really there's no difference there, but personalities take over, and they use doctrine as an excuse. But I have seen a case or two where it was a loggerhead of doctrine that could not be. It was one way or the other, and it had to end up in division. But in most cases I've seen too, if all of us would be submissive to the Lord's will and put His cause first and not our own, so many of these situations would just evaporate on their own because they are foolish, they are ignorant. There's really nothing to what we're insisting on. Anybody else have any examples besides color of carpet? Because that's one we can all agree on, I think. Although I think we can all agree on it.
Isn't he basically saying anything not taught by God? What he's talking about here is, this is not over scripture or anything like that. I don't think it's just foolish and unlearned questions avoid, and it's things not taught.
Well, yes, but some of it is. It's not so much an argument about the actual word itself as, he's talked in other places about striving over words. And we need to know what the words of Scripture mean and what they say. Not saying that's not the case. But it's almost like the legalistic fine-tuning that the Pharisees wanted to place upon language so that something would mean something here, but it wouldn't mean it here. And so it'd always be playing fast and loose with the definition of terms. So it always caught you in the wrong side of the argument. That kind of argument with the Word is like we talked last time about being able to use the Bible and teach so many false things, not handling the Bible aright. Well, those kind of arguments about the Scripture can become meaningless and ignorant because we're not really trying to get to the bottom of what the Bible says. We're trying to get our point across and using the Bible as leverage for that in a way where the context won't support it. But we still, the reason I'm mentioning this is we still today have this same problem that Timothy was being warned about here. And if there's anything we need to be very, very concerned about and watchful for, it's this very thing of arguing and eventually dividing over things that the Bible just does not talk about, that we're just kind of making up in our own minds the way we'd like things to be. And so I mentioned the color of carpet. Another might be the time of services on Sunday. Or whether you have, I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but there was a time years ago when accidentally, it was an accident, the song leader on Sunday morning, a young man who had, I think this was his first time to lead on Sunday morning, he got flustered and announced the invitation song when he was supposed to be doing the Lord's Supper. And so he was supposed to be having the song for the Lord's Supper, and then having that. And instead, he got flustered and he led the song and said, the invitation song will be so-and-so. And I didn't even want to embarrass the man, so I got up and we had a lesson on the Lord's Supper, after which we had the Lord's Supper. You would have thought that the world had come to an end. That's not the way we do things. The Lord's Supper has to be before the lesson and not after the lesson. And I had to tell them, well, it wasn't purposeful, it was accidental. But the thing is, it didn't matter. But it's amazing how many times things that don't matter, for some of us, that's a hill we'll die on. And it just shouldn't be. Yes, ma'am.
I can remember growing up, they didn't want to have the Lord's Supper before because there'd be people that would just take that and leave. So they would put it at the end of the preacher's sermon. So that
Yeah, and I tell you, whether it's the carpet or the time of service or the order of service, or like you say, what part you put the Lord's Supper in, there's always good reasons why you've got the position you've got. I promise you. Nobody says, this is my idea. It's terrible and nobody's going to like it. I don't even like it, but here's my idea. Nobody ever does that. Everybody says, this is the way we should do it because, and in their own mind, they have a rationale for it. And I've heard that one too, yes. You have it at the end, so basically you use it as bait or a motivation. They're not going to leave before the sermon because they want to be there for the Lord's Supper. It's kind of like where, Brother so-and-so hadn't attended for 6 months. Let's make him a Bible school teacher. And that way we'll have him teach Bible class. Well, sometimes the rationale is ridiculous when you think about it. But anyway, there's always a reason why these things are decided upon. And the whole point is, Paul's saying, don't get involved in these arguments over these meaningless matters of minutia and trivia, things that just don't matter. Before we leave this, anything besides the order of service and the color of carpet and where you put the Lord's Supper that you might put in this category?
Experience, and of course, as a young Christian, I'm going to. I've got a lot of room for growth still yet, and I've acted foolishly at times, and not so much as a church as a whole, but two people who became good friends. There was a discussion one time about the 23rd Psalm and what the King James Version says, and how the words that are used there with the these and the thous. And there became an argument, no, it doesn't have those words. Yes, it does. And the two friends, I was included in one of those, but it was like, why did it have to escalate to an argument of point over just the language being used?
That's a good example of I don't know how algorithms work. I really don't. But for some reason, on one of the it was Facebook or some social media thing I'm following, I guess I click one too many times on a certain subject, because now that's all I'm getting is King James only preachers that get all worked up. And before I came to Tulsa, I used the King James, and I really updated all the way up to the New King James now. But the fact is, a lot of translations are good translations. There are some that I would avoid, but by and large, there are a number of good translations. But these preachers that I've somehow gotten the algorithm to see all of their, and most of them are not preachers for the Church of Christ. But their whole existence is based upon we're King James only, we'll die King James only, and one of them went so far as to say we want the same Bible that the Apostle Paul used, the King James Version. I don't know if he knew, he got wound up in saying it, but I don't know if he thought that matter through. But bless his heart, King James hadn't been born when Paul was around, and Paul didn't even speak English. But anyway, some things we can get very worked up about that we shouldn't. And
caught up in habits. We form habits and traditions that we get caught up in. Sometimes I think we need to kind of change things around a little bit just because of that. But I was rebuked pretty severely by one of the older ladies one time for dismissing service with a song instead of a prayer.
and now we're on the matter of opinion here, but I couldn't agree with you more. Opinion-wise, judgment-wise, I think it would behoove, you don't change things just to change things, but every once in a while you change just enough to make it, you don't want it to end up where a generation later you think, well, this is what the Bible teaches. If you put an extra song before the prayer, you've done it unscripturally. If you don't end the service in just this right way, you're not scriptural. When so much of this is traditional in the way we've chosen over the years, and the reason you do traditional things is because they traditionally work. But we should never get the idea that just because we have decided to do something in a certain way, that the Bible doesn't speak of. The Bible talks about the items of worship, but never talks about the order of the items of worship. Those matters of tradition we place that are our ideas, it's always good to, every once in a while, change things for the very purpose of making people realize these are just our ideas, they're not Bible-based. Anyway, that said, class is over. And traditionally, we always get up and mill around for a while before worship. And so let's follow tradition for the moment.
Do you think instead of buzzer you can have a gong?
Well, I'm afraid I was.